Relationship violence is a problem in the United States. How big a problem is it? Some might say it's of epidemic proportions. Here are some statistics from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. During 1 year, this equates to more than 10 million women and men. 1 in 5 women in the United States has been raped in their lifetime. Only 34% of people who are injured by intimate partners receive medical care for their injuries. And in case you don't see the business implications, victims of intimate partner violence lose a total of 8 million paid days of work each year, with the cost of such incidents exceeding $8.3 billion. Today we'll hear from Professor Tom DeLong about his case entitled One Life, One Love. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you're listening to Cold Call.
So we are all sitting there in the classroom.
The professor walks in
and they look up and you know it's coming. Oh, the dreaded cold call.
Tom DeLong teaches courses focused on leadership, organizational behavior, managing human capital, and career management. He's written over 100 cases on those topics and several books, including his most recent, Flying Without a Net, Turn Fear of Change into Fuel for Success. Tom, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
This is obviously this is an emotional case, and it has a kind of a shocking beginning. And, it's about a topic that is very much in the headlines today and sadly has been in the headlines for a long time and shows no signs of dissipating. But I wonder if you could start, and by the way, I should also mention, as the father of 2 daughters, I read this with great interest. I know you have 5 daughters
That's
of your
correct,
own,
yeah.
so I'm sure this hits close to home for you as well. But maybe you can start just by telling us who's the protagonist in this case and what is on her mind.
Katie Hood was my student and graduated from Harvard Business School in 2001. She joined the Michael J. Fox Foundation because she was interested in social enterprise and doing good and had a remarkable run there, and then was at a transition point. And what we know about human behavior is that it's during transitions that you kind of see the mettle of the person and you kind of see how they deal with crucibles and different situations. And at this time, she was considering remaining a full-time mom. And at the same time, she heard about this event at the University of Virginia about a star lacrosse player who was killed by her long-term boyfriend who was jealous and under the influence. And it set off quite a stir, and it set off a stir for her of asking herself questions like, why is this happening? Why have we evolved as a society where we don't understand the importance of symmetry in relationships, in the importance that humans place on being connected and being invested in a relationship where both parties are invested the same? And so I was interested in finding a protagonist who was interested in purpose and interested in moving through a transition, and here she was being asked to lead this foundation, and actually like a movement. And so I asked her whether we could begin the process of writing a case.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the catalyst for the One Life, One Love Foundation. Can you give us more context for what happened with that event and talk a little bit about Yeardley Love?
It was in 2010, in May. In fact, Yardley was just a few weeks from graduation. She was impatient with her boyfriend and how she was being treated, and they dated for 2-3 years. And she had another date, and her old boyfriend didn't find that, it brought out some behaviors in him that really frightened a lot of different people. And he went and late at night basically attacked her. And then the next morning when her roommates came back, she wasn't alive. Mm. And the part that is important about this situation is that every person in that community, in that ecosystem said, I worried about him. Mm-hmm. And yet nobody said anything. Nobody stepped forward and said, I don't think you ought to date him, et cetera, et cetera. What happened is that Yardley's mother and sister and cousin basically created a foundation. Yeah. They named it One Love. And then the question is the business question is how do you create a movement? More important, how do you create a movement around a topic that is so hard to talk about as relationship violence?
Yeah. And one other thing that was important about that case, because I remember it well, it made national headlines. They were both Division I athletes playing for one of the best-known lacrosse programs in the country. This brought attention to this particular case, whereas these kinds of incidents have been happening and continue to happen for a long time, very much under the radar screen.
5 years ago, a woman came to me and said, I'd like to do a study on how frightened women are working on Wall Street. So she did some extensive interviews on campus, and there were 200 women that came forth, wanted to be interviewed, about having situations in their 3 to 5 years in the financial services world where they were in a position of being frightened. Mm-hmm. For some reason, the men in our culture haven't figured out quite how to use power and understand the concept of control. They haven't learned how to problem solve. And I'm making some gross generalizations, but they haven't figured out how to deal with their own emotions. And one of the things we teach in the course, and we're trying to teach our students, about having the courage to be what I call maturely vulnerable and talk about things in a way where you share more than just superficial issues. And so things build up over time. There have been women in my class who have written reflections that have said things like, I've been in an abusive relationship for 5 years, but I didn't want to hurt him by leaving the relationship. Mm. So what's happened in this whole movement is that when Katie Hood is at an MBA program and is sharing the data and talking about the program, the MBA students say, well, you should be doing this at the college level. And now she's been to over 400 universities. When she goes to undergraduates, the undergraduates say, listen, you need to go to high schools. Yeah. And she goes to the high schools, and they say, you've got to start this earlier. Mm. And so one of the ways that she has moved, how the paradigm has shifted, is moving from talking about just relationship violence to healthy relationships. Mm-hmm. It's a reframe, and it gives them psychological permission to talk more about it as opposed to something that sounds so hostile.
Right, and it's looking at the solution rather than the problem. We all know the problem's there, so let's talk about the solution. So what is Katie and One Love trying to accomplish? What's their ambition?
Well, I think that what she says is that I want to do for relationship violence and healthy relationships do what the mothers did for MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, mm-hmm. that it became something that just wasn't a fad, but it began to change the way that legislatures looked at penalties towards drunk driving. So her goal, and it's very aspirational, and the question, and of course, is in one of these movements is how much time is she involved with informing or inspiring or asking for money? Yeah. That's one of the leadership questions that begins to emerge as I talk to her and advise her. But she wants this to spread throughout the country.
Yeah, and so how do you do that? Like, what's the approach that you take? She's a force of one. It's a small organization. She is burdened with the need to raise money. Otherwise, you can't sustain the operation. So how do you divide your time?
Well, one is that she's brought in some fabulous professionals who are as committed to this work as she is. The other thing is that she's found that the easiest thing is raising money. But the key for her is to create an atmosphere at a local level where individuals who have never talked about this whole notion of interaction and symmetry in relationships, of how to get that out to kids at a reasonably young age so that they can begin to have conversations with their parents. But what we're finding is that parents aren't talking to their kids about relationships. This is an educational, inspirational process.
Mm-hmm. And you've got to sort of empower other people to be influencers in this, right?
Yes. One of the things that's been interesting for her is that when she goes to administrators in universities, many of them are very reluctant to get involved with this because they want to control information. They want to control the incidences that may have taken place. And it's like they're dealing with issues around control and power themselves about managing image, managing their own reputation. But I do believe that what she would hope is that they'll move from relationship violence to healthy relationships to what they're going to call now in the coming year, it's love better. And to really play on that and see how, for me, it's to understand how women and men can talk about this concept of what does it mean to love and care about somebody else more than you care about yourself.
Yeah. So what's Katie like? I was interested in reading about, in the case, about some of her hesitancy in taking over this role. And some of it had to do with the fact that she was a mom of 2 young kids. But there was another interesting dimension to that, just about her own insecurity.
Well, the question is if I take this on, can I do it?
Yeah.
And she actually said at one point, she said, and one of the reasons I approached her is that so many of our students here say, well, I'd like to know what my purpose is. Now, many of them haven't had many road miles, so it's difficult to come up with the purpose. But she says, I wanted a purpose that I could commit my life to. And she says, I actually felt like God spoke to me. Now, she says it, quote, God spoke to her, and said, this is your calling. This is what you need to be about. And then that's when the insecurities started to take over because she said, this is what I need to be about. Mm-hmm. And am I up to it?
Yeah.
And I think for all of us, when we take on something different, it's never going to be how we thought it was. We never get the right vision. And I also think that it's typically harder than we thought.
Yeah, yeah. What were some of the issues that, and I think about this more in the context, I guess, of people who are listening who may be in organizations or they've got fledgling things that they're trying to get started. What are some of the things they should think about as they begin to shape that idea?
I think the first thing is that while it's important to have quick successes, I think if you move too fast, then you lose out in creating a foundation of relationships and people that you can rely on. I think it's very tough to become the sole leader. And I think that there's always this question around, am I going to join this movement because I'm inspired by Katie or I've been converted to the cause? And I think you need to take the time to kind of look at the motivations of people around why they are, in fact, joining this movement.
Yeah. Have you discussed the case in class?
I did a run-through with some executives.
Yeah.
And one of the dilemmas with the case is that people start to turn inward and begin to reflect on their own experiences. And it's like they psychologically and emotionally leave the class during the discussion. The other thing is it's typical, is that they might be critical of how Katie has managed, which I'm just fine with. But I also think that it's a way for them to deflect when they're thinking about the kinds of relationships that they form and also how they use power and control to get their way.
Yeah, I would imagine part of the challenge for you in the class is how do I get people to focus on the business side of this and separate themselves from the emotional part of it?
It's a tough process. But again, anybody who comes to this campus, we want them to have a transformational experience, and that means tough work for the faculty.
Yeah. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You can find the One Life, One Love case, along with thousands of others, in the HBR case collection at hbr.org. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you've been listening to Cold Call.